A presidential announcement can sound final right up until Congress asks to see the paper. That's exactly what's happening with Trump's Iran deal today. The White House is talking like the hard part is over, but senators are saying they still don't know what they're actually being asked to approve. And while Washington argues over signatures and timelines, the military picture, the regional fallout, and the civilian costs are all still moving. Good morning, and welcome back to Daily. Today's news is packed with a familiar pattern: big claims first, details later, and accountability somewhere down the road if it ever shows up at all. We've got the Trump administration's Iran agreement getting a cold reception on Capitol Hill, contradictions about whether the Strait of Hormuz blockade is really over, new developments from the G7 summit, fresh damage in Ukraine, civilian deaths tied to US-backed strikes in Nigeria, a grim World War II site resurfacing in Thailand, and another example of how due process keeps getting treated like an optional extra. And if you're getting value from this, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The first thing to understand is that this Iran announcement is being greeted less like a victory lap and more like a request for receipts. Trump says the agreement with Iran is underway, with a ceremonial signing planned for Friday in Geneva. The basic outline sounds dramatic: reopen the Strait of Hormuz, lift the US naval blockade in the region, offer financial incentives to Iran if it meets certain benchmarks, and then move into a 60-day negotiation window for the larger risks, including Iran's nuclear program. But on Capitol Hill, the reaction has been a lot closer to, hold on, what exactly did we agree to? Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he simply didn't know enough about it. That's not a small detail. If the top Republican in the Senate says the people closest to the issue still don't have the full picture, then this isn't a finished deal. It's a political announcement, looking for a policy. And that's where the scrutiny starts to matter. Congress is supposed to be notified before major developments, especially when they involve war, sanctions, military posture, and the movement of ships through one of the most important waterways on Earth. Yet lawmakers are saying they were not fully briefed, or in some cases, not briefed at all. Vice President J.D. Vance tried to fill in the blanks by saying the memorandum of understanding had already been signed digitally on Sunday night. An unnamed official even said Trump and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf had signed it. But Tehran hasn't confirmed that version, and until both sides are working from the same text, signed is doing a lot of heavy lifting. That matters because this is one of those foreign policy moments where the language can get ahead of reality very quickly. The administration wants to frame this as movement toward peace. Critics on Capitol Hill want to know whether it is actually a binding agreement, a loose framework, or just a pause button with better branding. From a common sense standpoint, that skepticism is healthy. If the United States is going to pull back a blockade, adjust sanctions, and potentially reduce military forces in the region, Americans deserve more than a victory post and a promise that the details are coming later. And that's not some radical position, that's basic governance. The second problem is that the story is already contradicting itself. A U.S. military notice to merchant ships said the blockade on Iranian ports remains in effect pending execution of the ceasefire deal. That directly undercuts the White House line that the blockade has been lifted. And the wording in that advisory is not subtle. It warns ships not to attempt passage without explicit direction, and says failures to comply could result in rapid escalation, including disabling or destructive fire. That's not the language of a settled peace. That's the language of a military standoff with a fresh coat of diplomatic paint. If you're wondering why people on Capitol Hill are uneasy, that's why. Because the administration can say one thing at a microphone, while the military is telling commercial captains something else entirely. There's also a broader issue here that doesn't get enough attention. The public gets told these actions are precise, limited, and necessary, but the human and economic costs are rarely discussed in full. According to the reporting, the U.S. has already bombed several civilian commercial ships in enforcing the blockade since April, including one attack last week that killed 3 Indian mariners. That should not be a footnote. It should be the headline before anybody starts celebrating a deal. This is where a more skeptical, less imperial mindset becomes useful. Americans have no shortage of problems at home, so before we casually accept another open-ended security mission in the Persian Gulf, the questions should be simple. What are we doing? Who authorized each step? How many civilians are being put at risk? And what does success actually look like? The administration says it still wants to keep a strong military posture in the Middle East until there's a final nuclear deal. Fine, then say that plainly. Don't tell the public the blockade is over, while your own military advisory says it isn't. That kind of split-screen messaging might work for a few hours. It doesn't survive scrutiny for long. The same day this Iran story is being picked apart in Washington, Trump is also at the G7 summit, where foreign leaders are trying to juggle Ukraine, Iran, and global energy security all at once. Trump was seated between Emmanuel Macron and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which is the kind of diplomatic body language people read into whether they admit it or not. He's also scheduled to meet Modi one-on-one, and the summit's working session is all about forging new partnerships and rebuilding solidarity. That sounds nice. It also sounds like the kind of phrase leaders use when they're trying to make a room full of competing interests sound like a team. On Ukraine, Trump said Russia should make a peace deal and claimed he's trying to help end the war. He also repeated his familiar line that he has settled 8 wars, a claim that remains heavily disputed. Still, the bigger point is clear. Washington wants to be seen as steering toward peace, even while the battlefield keeps producing new shocks. One of those shocks came in Kyiv, where Russia's bombardment reportedly damaged the Dormition Cathedral at the Kyiv-Pechursk Lavra, a nearly 1,000-year-old site, also known as the Monastery of the Caves. Photos and videos showed the cathedral on fire after a major drone and missile attack. Both sides immediately went into blame mode. Ukraine said Russian drones hit the cathedral. Moscow denied that and claimed the damage came from a Ukrainian Patriot interceptor. That's become the modern war playbook: strike, deny, counter-deny, and leave everyone else trying to separate fact from fog. The attack killed 11 Ukrainian civilians, according to Zelensky, while Russian officials said Ukrainian drones killed at least 3 civilians in Tula. And that right there is the ugly arithmetic of this war. Military language on one side, civilian graves on both. Meanwhile, the G7 also discussed the Iran deal and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. French President Macron said the priority was a solid, serious agreement. That's diplomatic language for, we all know this could still go sideways. And it probably could, because the region is still full of unresolved conflicts that keep feeding each other. Israel's war in Lebanon is still shaping Iran's posture. The Gaza war is still unresolved. The maritime picture remains tense, and whenever officials say a second stage of negotiations will be easier, that's usually the moment the hardest part starts. Now for the part that tends to get buried when international headlines get too abstract: the people actually living under these decisions. In Nigeria, US and Nigerian forces carried out strikes that the administration described as a major counterterrorism success. Trump and AFRICOM said more than 175 ISIS fighters were eliminated, including a top commander. Nigerian officials echoed that celebration. But villagers in Metele told a very different story. They said the strikes hit residential areas, destroyed homes, and killed civilians, including women and children. One local leader shared a list of 27 dead civilians. A hospital doctor said several non-combatants died from injuries after being brought in. That's exactly why civilian harm oversight matters, not as a slogan, not as a press release, as a real constraint on power. And as that sounds uncomfortably close to a pattern, that's because it is. The Pentagon's own Inspector General reportedly warned that the department is not properly equipped to carry out its civilian harm mitigation plan after staffing cuts and reassignments. So when officials cheer precision strikes and ask for trust, it's fair to ask whether there's any serious mechanism left to verify the results. The logic also gets shaky when US involvement is justified in broad moral terms, like defending Christians in Nigeria, while the reality on the ground is far more complicated. Nigeria's insurgencies are messy, local, and brutal. That's exactly why American leaders should be careful before treating them like a clean morality clay. Then there's the legal piece, which is just as important. In Israel, the Supreme Court once again upheld the detention of Palestinian Dr. Hussam Abu Safia without criminal charges. He's been held for more than 500 days under the unlawful combatants law, in solitary confinement, with rights groups saying he's denied proper medical care. Whatever one thinks of the wider war, indefinite detention without charges should bother anybody who still cares about due process. If a government can label someone a threat and keep him locked up without a trial, then the legal principle is doing less work than the political label. And finally, there's one quieter story that still says a lot about war and memory. In Thailand, a station on the old Death Railway resurfaced from beneath a reservoir after maintenance drained the water. Researchers rushed in to survey the site before the rainy season fills it back up. The railway was built by Allied prisoners of war and forced laborers, and tens of thousands died. It's a brutal reminder that wars leave behind more than headlines. They leave scars on the land, in families, and in generations that never got a vote. And on a lighter note, the World Cup is also rolling on, with Argentina opening against Algeria in Kansas City. Messi is making a record 6th World Cup appearance, and Algeria comes in with real momentum. In a news cycle full of explosions, court rulings, and diplomatic spin, it's almost relaxing to have one story where the biggest debate is whether a team can defend a title. So the big picture today is pretty straightforward. 1. Trump's Iran deal is not as settled as the White House wants it to look, and Capitol Hill is demanding details before anyone calls it a success. 2. The military and diplomatic messages do not fully match, which is usually a sign that the public is being sold the ending before the script is finished. 3. The rest of the world is still on fire in smaller but meaningful ways: Ukraine, Nigeria, Lebanon, Gaza, and legal battles over detention and accountability. And 4. The same principle keeps coming back no matter the country or conflict. If power is being used in your name, you should be allowed to see the evidence, the costs, and the exit plan. If this breakdown helps separate the signal from the spin, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with the one story you think needs the most scrutiny. I read through a lot of the noise so you don't have to, and I'll see you in the next one.